Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 10 of the Fair Housing Insiders. Today's topic is fair housing and senior living and the unique challenges that come with that. So in our second part of that segment of the Fair Housing 5, we're going to share with you our top 5 challenges that you see in senior living. So we're going to use some segments from our senior living course, and you'll be able to find out more about that in the show notes below. So let's dig right in. And we're going to have Kathy kind of give us some feedback on each of these particular situations that we find in senior housing and what are the challenges that are unique to them. So number 5, let's look at senior living and health challenge questions. Take a look at this clip.
Now let's listen in on Edna's conversation with Annie at Main Street Senior Care, which is a continuing care retirement community.
Now that we've gone over the financial part of the application, let's talk about what you need, Edna. You already said that your daughter does not want you to live independently. I can see that you will need to live in one of our first floor assisted living options and possibly down the road transfer into the skilled nursing center if it comes to that. But for now, I can give you a list of the services I know you will need. I see you're in a wheelchair right now. Do you need help with bathing or using the restroom? What other health challenges do you have?
That clip is a great example of the challenges and the very unique challenges that senior housing providers have. Obviously, when people move in to a senior property, they're older, much older, some of them, than what we would think of as a typical apartment community. And with that aging process, often comes impairments, mental impairments and physical impairments. And sometimes senior housing providers want to get into those needs that their resident has. Now, let's be clear. A lot of times this is for the best of intentions. This is because they want the person to be safe and comfortable. They want their family to be happy with the place they live. But in doing that, oftentimes they cross the line of asking about disabilities. And the Fair Housing Act doesn't make an exception for senior housing providers. So the same rules apply about disabilities, about reasonable accommodations that apply to all housing environments, and senior housing providers sometimes fail to take that into consideration.
Very good. Thank you, Kathy, for that. So that's number 5. And if you're enjoying this video so far, don't forget, please give us a thumbs up. We really appreciate all of our community who are on our YouTube channel. So that brings us to number 4, the fourth most common challenge that we find in senior living, and that is scooters. So take a look at this clip from our senior housing course, and we'll get your feedback, Kathy.
As her granddaughter is pushing her through the halls, she runs into Annie and excitedly tells her that the family had gotten together to purchase her a scooter so she doesn't have to walk to her favorite restaurant down the street. Edna loves eating out, but she finds it harder and harder to walk short distances these days. Annie informs her that although she can use the scooter on the property, there are a number of scooter rules she needs to know, and she's not permitted to use her scooter in the dining room.
Well, certainly scooters or electric wheelchairs are something that are very common now, and just a few years ago were not common. Most of the buildings, the senior living buildings, were not built with the thought of many of those large electric vehicles roaming around their hallways and in their dining rooms and in their apartments. And so in an effort to protect the building and protect the other residents, a lot of senior housing providers have a lot of rules about safety, understandably, but also rules that sometimes burden the people that need to use scooters. And that has been the subject of repeated litigation And one case that I'm going to talk about when we finish this. So scooters and their regulations are an important consideration from a fair housing standpoint, because many of the people that use those scooters are disabled and have rights as people with disabilities.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah, looking forward to your comments on that particular court case. So stay tuned, everyone. At the conclusion of our Fair Housing 5, we're going to hear some comments about this case, and you'll find it very, very interesting how it relates to senior housing and some things to think about. So thank you, Kathy. So that brings us to number 3, which is transfer. So let's take a look at this clip, and we'll look forward to your comments, Kathy.
Transfers are a common request in senior communities. Many struggle to know whether or not this is an accommodation that they are required to grant.
Transfers is an issue that arises in all housing, but perhaps the more complicated examples come out of senior housing, and there are a lot of different ones. For instance, in a community such as a continuing care community, we call them often CCRCs, where there are a variety of levels of care, some offering medical assistance, some offering personal living assistance, and some offering no assistance at all. And in some of those communities, a person will start out in an apartment or a condo where there's no personal services attached. But over time, that person's health decreases and now they need services. And in many CCRCs, there is the expectation that that person will leave their apartment and move to an assisted living unit, which is usually more cramped, usually much more small. And some residents don't want to make that transfer. So there have been a variety of cases about whether it is a reasonable accommodation to permit a person like that, who now needs some kind of services, to remain in the unit they've been living in, or whether the property can require that transfer up to a different level of care. And that has all kinds of fair housing connotations, because we're talking about a person with disabilities, and do they have a right to a reasonable accommodation so that they can stay where they are? So that's one example. Then there are other examples involving transfers to a more accessible unit, or transfers in a walk-up building from the second floor down to the first floor, because perhaps while the person that lived there, their mobility has decreased dramatically and now they can't climb the stairs. Again, a number of lawsuits about that issue, some with pretty awful results for a housing provider who failed to see the issue as a fair housing issue and provide a resolution for it. So it is the kind of thing that senior housing providers have got to keep in mind and keep an eye on.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, another solid reason why it's so important. That's why we're so grateful, aren't we, Kathy, to be able to provide these videos for awareness and education, but also to enforce how important it is to move beyond the basics when it comes to fair housing, and to really understand the housing market that you're in, that niche market, and being able to successfully answer all those questions. What would you do if you're in that situation? So thank you for that explanation. So that brings us to our number 2 most common challenge within senior living, and that's independent living. So let's take a look at this clip and we'll get your comments, Kathy.
Just to clarify, we are an adult community for those who are 55 and older, and we do not provide any kind of personal assistive services. Is that what you are looking for?
Yes, we are. However, I am losing my eyesight, and within about 2 years, I will need to have a home aide move in with us temporarily until I can get used to my new service dog. Is that going to be a problem?
Well, We do have a strict no pet policy, and as I mentioned, we have a 55 years or older policy for all of our residents. Any age you bring in would probably be under the age of 55. Besides, this is an independent living community, which means that you need to be able to live without outside assistance. You may need an assisted living facility if you will need that kind of help.
The concept of independent living is certainly one with a very complex history. First of all, let me acknowledge that the term independent living community is very common in the senior housing industry. It is used everywhere. By itself, it is not necessarily a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Where we have the problem, though, is just as in that video clip, people think if their community is independent living, then what that must mean is that people who have severe impairments, such as the example of perhaps the resident in the clip who might be going completely blind and need an aide, need a guide dog, and is that person still able to live independently? What about people who are growing older and who are losing a lot of their mental faculties? Are they able to live independently? And if not, does that mean they need to move from your senior living community? So the problem with independent living is what it infers. And I have, throughout my career, I have seen so much litigation about this, and so many senior housing providers have been injured with these lawsuits because they failed to see that if you're going to start talking about independent living, you are very directly talking about people's disabilities. And the Fair Housing Act says you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. That is also one of the issues in the case that I'm going to talk about at the end of this segment.
Very good. Yeah, excellent points, Kathy. So far we've covered health challenge questions, scooters, transfers, independent living, and that brings us to our number one unique challenge that we find among senior living when it comes to fair housing, and that is failing health. So if you've enjoyed this episode so far, thank you in advance for giving us those thumbs up. We really appreciate your support in our community channel. So let's take a look at this clip, Failing Health, and then we'll listen to your takeaway, Kathy, on it. And also, we look forward to your comments about this court case. So let's look at this clip.
What happens when a resident's health is failing and they are incapable of caring for themselves? The problem is further complicated if the resident's family is not willing to step up. The fact that this situation raises fair housing issues further complicates an already extremely difficult reality for senior communities where residents are aging in place.
You know, when they created the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and they created the regulations that go along with it, no one that was in the process of that development of that law thought about how does this law impact senior living, where the residents may come in very healthy and within 5 years or 10 years become very impaired. Some of those residents are so impaired that they are no longer safe to continue to live by themselves in that unit. And the housing provider is watching that deterioration. I see this as the number one fair housing challenge of senior housing providers, because it is a very difficult situation. People who operate senior housing are usually absolutely the best intentioned people and care about their residents and want to create a safe, healthy environment for their residents to live in, when they feel like they can't do that for certain residents because of their deteriorating health, what they want to do is work with the family, if there is one, work with the resident, work with social service agencies, and find that person a better, more safe place to live. Be aware that while that process, that intention is so well-meaning, it can also be a fair housing violation, because what we're saying is to that resident, you are too disabled to live here. And the Fair Housing Act does not permit a housing provider, no matter how well-intentioned, to say that. There are methods of accomplishing perhaps what that resident needs, but it has to be done very carefully and thoughtfully, always with this fair housing limit behind the process that's used. So I have dealt with so many clients who have struggled so hard with this one. And, it's one of those situations where there's different good outcomes. Sometimes there's very bad outcomes, but it is something that no senior housing provider should undertake without a thorough understanding of the fair housing issues involved.
Yeah, very good. And training for their people, for sure. Make sure everybody's on board, not just leadership. So thank you so much for giving us those takeaways. So now we've all been kind of looking forward to your brief summary on a court case that you've become aware of. Can you give us some snippets of that and how it related to the Senior Housing Property Management Company?
This is such a good example. This is a brand new settlement that was just announced in June of 2020 between the Department of Justice, who sued a senior housing provider in Pennsylvania. So there were three companies, the owner, the management agent, the former owner, and they all got sued. And this was a property that was known as an independent living property. And what the Justice Department said was that that property had been discriminating against its residents on the basis of their disability since 2005. So for a very, very long time. And they cited three violations. The first was that the property required residents who used scooters, electric wheelchairs, to transfer from those into a chair when they used the dining room. Another thing that this property supposedly did is it charged a deposit for the use of scooters because of the damage that is frequently done to the building with the use of scooters. And finally, the Department of Justice said this property talked a lot in its lease about the need for its residents to live independently. And if you'll remember, that's one of our top five, along with the scooter rules.
Yep.
And what the Department of Justice said was the lease said that the housing facility may have to conduct an assessment of the person's physical condition at the time they entered. And if their physical condition deteriorated, especially if the resident got certain illnesses, that the property would evict them from this senior living place because they were no longer able to live independently. So I think you can see from just the issues in this one case, all of the perils that not understanding how the Fair Housing Act impacts senior living communities could have. Now, these mistakes that this property made could cost it anywhere. There is a fund it has to create that is either at the level of $250,000 up to $350,000, depending on how many people come forward and say, yeah, I used to live there, or yeah, I live there now, and they discriminated against me. And then they pay each of those people that might come forward. But the minimum they have to pay is $250,000, could be $350,000, and they have to pay a civil money penalty to the government for discriminating at $55,000. So those were very painful lessons that property learned about not understanding its fair housing responsibilities.
Yeah, those are some big bills. We want all of our clients and our community to avoid it if at all possible. So appreciate so much you sharing that summary, Kathy. And it's a good reminder that we can't be complacent about fair housing, and we can't just be happy with the basics. Like when it comes to the sectors of housing, and in today's episode we're talking about senior living, that there's so much more to it, which is why, as a recap, let's review the 5 top items and challenges that we see people facing when it comes to senior living. Number 5, health challenge questions. Number 4, scooters. Number 3, transfers. Number 2, independent living. And number 1, failing health. All are very deep topics, and we appreciate your insight, Kathy, on what are some questions that come up with each of these challenges, and we need to know the answers. So I hope confident you've enjoyed the little segments that we've provided from our senior living course, these various little outtakes from it and scenarios and interactions that come up in it. So if you'd like more information about the course, please just take a look at the show notes or go to fairhousinginstitute.com/courses, and you'll be able to find out more about the courses that are available. So again, thank you so much, Kathy, for your insight and your summary. Give us a thumbs up, everyone. We appreciate your support. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel already, please do so. And we look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.